Florida's controversial parental rights and education bill, also known as the Don't Say Gay legislation, is threatening to pull a decades-long student support guides implemented to help teachers maneuver the issues of LGBTQ+ students in class and after-school clubs.
Now, even though the word gay is not written in the bill, it does prohibit instruction relating to gender identity and sexual orientation, kindergarten through third grade, and potentially restricts instruction for some older students as well.
Meanwhile, the New York Times dug deep on how DeSantis changed Florida's political landscape and suggested presidential ambitions. The report reads, quote, Florida has transformed over the past 2 years as Governor Ron DeSantis has increased and flexed his power to remarkable effect, embracing policies that once seemed unthinkable. That has made the Republican governor a favorite of the party's Fox News viewing base and turned him into a possible presidential contender. Here to discuss are Democratic strategist Kristal and partner at the CGCN group, Sam Geduldig. Welcome to you both.
Good morning.
Thank you.
So, Sam, what should we know? What is really the news peg of this? Why are we talking about this in particular today? Has anything changed of late?
Well, I think if you talk to Republican voters or Republican members of Congress, they feel bullied. You know, the way that I think mainstream news media covers Republican policies in these issues, it portrays them as the bully. And I think the way the Republican voter and member of Congress and senator and presidential candidate feels is they're protecting bullied parents who don't want these policies shoved down their kids' throats or the way they're raising their kids. So they feel bullied by the national media. They feel bullied by Hollywood and the morals that wind up in kids shows. They feel bullied by teachers unions. They feel bullied by Fauci, who's insisting that their children wear masks, despite the fact that they think that the kids are at low risk. They feel bullied by a Congress that is controlled by Democrats. They feel bullied by a Democratic presidential administration. They feel bullied by everyone. And in their view, I think this is them pushing back on all of those institutional bullies.
Yeah, Kristal, I've said on this show before, there are a lot of aspects of this law that I think are misguided and confusing and will, lead to a lot of frivolous lawsuits. But the principle that I think Republicans are making a central focus of their campaign, of their likely to be successful campaign to retake every level of government, is the idea that the school systems are out of touch with what parents actually want. They're teaching things that parents don't approve of, and they're hiding it, or they don't want to be transparent about it on subjects like gender, sexuality, and race. And Republicans are now making an attempt, that is the central push that they're making. What can Democrats and progressives, how can they answer that without resorting to a kind of, caricature of all these efforts as only about, animus toward marginalized groups?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think what we're seeing in Florida, really, if we analyze all of the legislation that's happened over the last 2 years, Florida has become ground zero for all things education and for all things as it relates to redistricting and, women's rights as well. But I think as it relates to education, what we're seeing with CRT becoming a critical issue, not only in, national politics, but also in state politics, what the other guests may call bullying, I think Democrats or progressives would call, limiting a child's expression to freely express him or herself, depending on how they choose to identify. And that's something that absolutely parents should, if there's a child under the age of 18, have a say-so in, but also children are their own person, and they also should have the opportunity to freely express themselves in a school setting. And so what we're seeing with these laws that are popping up, they're asking teachers to really protect students, but the legislation is limiting students' access to their freedom of expression, their freedom to choose and be and live out whomever they desire to be in this life. And so that's why these issues are so, controversial. And they're in the news all the time because it appears that this Republican-led legislature is intentionally creating laws that would make it harder for an LGBTQ student to freely express him or herself. And that just should not be the case in the educational setting.
Sam, how well do you think the Republican Party is navigating these issues? Because my sense is, right, more transparency, more giving back more control to parents, keeping some of the particularly divisive, more activist-adjacent training type stuff out of kindergarten through third grade is popular and is going to be a win for the Republican Party. But it's almost, I see how it can go too far and made it with like the sudden smear that absolutely everyone who disagrees with you is a groomer, which is like very reminiscent of everyone on the left calling you a racist if you disagree with them. Like, I'm going to be screamed at one or the other in that direction, like for all time, is miserable. Can the Republican Party, stay focused on this aspect of it without, going like way too far down the rabbit hole?
Yeah, this is politics, and in the mainstream media and cable news and the social media outlets are all amped up about this, and that creates heat. So right now Republicans feel like they're well situated on the side of more voters than less, and I think you'll see them continue to feel like they're in a good position. I think the reason Democrats are in the position they're in is because they're reacting to the base of their party, and they're pushing policies that I think some mainstream, more moderate or conservative Democrats can't get their arms around. Elections have consequences, and I assume, when Republicans have a good election in November, their base will push the party into positions that its moderate Republicans don't feel comfortable with. And we're just going to go back and forth. And because the media loves covering these fights, they draw a lot of attention to these issues. And, we can get into a whole conversation about how messed up the system is with, the stuff you guys cover, how you cover, not you personally, but the stuff media covers, how they cover it, what generates clicks, what generates attention, what generates, awards for, writing, and what members of Congress react to and what politicians react to, as far as, from small dollar donations to, media hits to, getting reelected to feeling like they're comfortable in their political positions. So unfortunately, it's probably not going to calm down. It'll just keep getting hotter and hotter is my prediction. Sam, it's a shame, but it's the system.
Sam, you mentioned that Democrats are pushing these policies and elections have consequences. I'm struck by the fact that we're talking about Florida, where there was a $15 minimum wage, for example, on the ballot in 2020. It passed overwhelmingly with 60% of the vote. And that election does not have consequences because Republicans in the state have been trying to push back against that ballot initiative ever since then. We have what we're talking about now is bills being put forward by Republicans, not Democrats, to create these laws. These are pre-existing advisory guidelines that have existed that don't have any binding effect, just guidelines for teachers of how to handle situations if a student comes to them with gender identity questions or issues. Is it really fair to characterize this as the Democrats launching a culture war when so many of these guidelines in the first place were a response to the fact that so many on the left and liberals and even moderates were concerned that sex education was being kept out of school, that there was a lot of influence from the religious right in school historically, and only just now have we had a little bit of a social shift where some of the more prevailing liberal norms are making it into the classroom. What is the chicken and the egg of this here?
I think more Republicans or more conservative voters are moving to the state, giving it, a redder hue than it has had in the past. And I do think that because there's more Republicans in the state and these issues are getting the attention for the reasons we talked about, it won't stop. And again, who decides who the bully is up to, each individual. And I think there's a lot more people, at least in Florida right now, that feel like this culture that, Democrats side with is unfair to these parents who feel helpless and don't want their kindergartners through third graders learning about these issues or even talking about them. And I just think there's more voters that feel that way than don't. So I think Republicans think it's A, a winning issue, B, an issue that they actually care about, and C, there's more Republicans in the state of Florida than there ever have been, and the state's trending redder. So, I guess I don't know how to answer the question any other way than I just think there's more Republicans in Florida now.
Yep. What's your response, Kristal?
Well, I think what we're seeing on the Republican side is Republicans decided to wage this education war after the 2020 elections, and it's that there's no other way to really quite frame it or explain it. And so this isn't a talking point that the progressives or the Democratic Party brought forth. This is something that was systematically created, curated, and now it's a major issue and messaging point for this midterm election. We also saw it become an issue in the gubernatorial election in Virginia, where the Republican candidate was successful. So that was a real bellwether whether or not CRT could really run a national campaign in a number of different states. And so when the other guest, speaks about this is something that people care about, this is something that the Republican Party cares about. They care about waging cultural wars through education. They have ginned up their base to their own credit on the education side. And so what that has forced the Democratic Party to do is to become more reactive instead of getting in front of the messaging, talking about how critical race theory is not taught in K through 12 education. This is something that, again, is a talking point that is really meant to divide this country, and it has divided the country, and it will continue throughout the midterm election. So what we'll see is, if this actually sticks, the first Senate elections are happening this month across a number of different states. And then the midterm elections will play out in November. And so we'll see if this has really been a successful strategy for the Republican Party come November.
Yes, waging a culture war does seem to have more legs than actually talking about wages. Thank you, Kristal. Thank you, Sam, for joining us today.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Up next, linguist Noam Chomsky named the only Western statesman who has suggested, quote, who has suggested the, quote, right way out of Ukraine. We'll find out who. Stay tuned.